Hey there! How's it going? Today, we're going to talk about the book Wuthering Heights. It's written by Emily Brontë, who is one of the famous Brontë sisters. This is Emily's only novel, an epic tale of love, hate, betrayal, and revenge. The story revolves around Heathcliff, an abandoned child, and Catherine Earnshaw, the Lady of Wuthering Heights, and their intense and tragic love affair. Emily Brontë paints an extreme world of love, hate, and complex emotions. When Wuthering Heights was published, its style was so unconventional that it got banned by the Western literary community for half a century. BBC has a documentary about the Brontë sisters, mentioning that in a desolate and remote village in the north of England, the sisters wrote their hugely influential works, Jane Eyre, Wuthering Heights, and Agnes Grey. Among the sisters, none lived past 39. Their lives were like fireworks, brief but dazzling. They had a pact since childhood: each of us has to write a novel and publish it together. Charlotte Brontë, the eldest, once sent her poems to the famous poet Robert Southey when she was 20. But he harshly criticized her, saying, "Literature is not the business of women. It's not even appropriate for women." Yeah, unfair, but that was the reality back then. Emily, the second sister, started with poetry. She was skilled at horse riding, loved dogs, especially big ones, and was a sharpshooter. Charlotte described her as stronger than men, purer than children. Emily was reserved, never pursued by anyone, and had no experience in love. Yet, the bizarre emotions, extreme love and hate, and passionate outbursts depicted in Wuthering Heights were all meticulously crafted by her. How did all this happen? Wuthering Heights is hailed as the pioneer of tortured love, featuring bold descriptions of sensuality and violence. No one at the time could have imagined it came from a young woman's pen. But after the novel's publication, the sisters could support themselves through writing, which was the greatest news for them. But the joy didn't last long. Tragedy struck. Less than a year after Wuthering Heights was published, Emily contracted tuberculosis. She then passed it on to her sister, and both succumbing to it. And was just 29 when she died. Matthew Arnold, a renowned literary critic and poet from England, wrote a poetry collection as a tribute to the Brontë sisters. In it, he praised Emily, saying she had an extraordinary fervor, intense emotions, melancholy, and boldness, unmatched since Byron's death. Let's delve into this scandalous Wuthering Heights. As of now, there are at least 14 different film and television adaptations of this novel. In the 1930s, Mr. Liang Shirqiu translated Wuthering Heights into Chinese, becoming the first person in China to do so. It was entitled Hu Xiao Shan Zhuang back then, but Pao Xiao Shan Zhuang in Chinese. Then in 1955, at the age of 36, Mr. Yang Yi translated it as Hu Xiao Shan Zhuang, a name that has stuck till today. We've talked about Ms. Yang Yi's book, 100 Years, Many People, Many Things, which also mentions this detail. The version we're using today is the new translation by Yan Xiu, a British Chinese writer, included in the author's list. This is also the second Chinese version of Wuthering Heights, collected by the Brontë Parsonage Museum, the first being Ms. Yang Yi's version. Let's talk about Wuthering Heights. Before this, I talked about Jane Eyre. Wuthering Heights and Jane Eyre give me completely different reading experiences. Jane Eyre is like a transparent jade, a bit like Shin Songwon's Border Town. You feel its beauty, clarity, and empowering sense. But Wuthering Heights is entirely different. The first time I read Wuthering Heights was probably when I was 14, and after finishing it, I felt like the whole world turned dark. It was during a summer vacation, and that summer felt bitterly cold, as if it dragged me into a realm of despair. I kept wondering how every character in the book could end up like that, so reckless, consumed by passion, filled with a chilling power. So later on, I read about the comment of Mom on Wuthering Heights. He exclaimed, "I don't know of any other novel that describes the pain, obsession, cruelty, and persistence in love so shockingly." You can't compare Wuthering Heights with any other book. Wuthering Heights fully portrays the wildness, passion, and heavy suppression of human nature, creating a vivid and painful experience akin to a Moor. Reading Wuthering Heights has 3 levels. The first level sees love and hate. The second level sees human nature. The third level leads to eternal belief. Let's talk about what Wuthering Heights is like. It's described in the novel as the name of Mr. Heathcliff's residence. Wuthering is a profound adjective used to express the weather that the place endures during storms. This place sounds uninviting, even a little eerie, which adds to its mystery. The story of Wuthering Heights unfolds in this isolated moor. On a stormy day, Lockwood, a young tenant of Thrushcross Grange, visits Mr. Heathcliff, the landlord of Wuthering Heights. The landlord is unfriendly, but due to the bad weather, Lockwood can't leave immediately, so he has to stay at Wuthering Heights. He meets the people around Mr. Heathcliff, including the indifferent daughter-in-law, the servant Hareton, and others, who behave very strangely and unfriendly towards Lockwood. This makes Lockwood very uncomfortable. Just when his anger and frustration are about to peak, a housekeeper named Zillah steps forward and shows him some kindness, which soothes Lockwood's emotions. Zillah leads Lockwood to a room to rest, and he discovers that the windowsill of the house is covered with writing. Upon closer inspection, he sees a name repeated over and over again: Catherine Earnshaw, Catherine Heathcliff, Catherine Linton. That name strikes him, Catherine. Let's remember it. This makes Lockwood curious about this Catherine. Who is she? Lockwood starts to peruse the notes and diaries she left behind, the naive strokes of her pen recording a young girl's joys and sorrows. As Lockwood reads on, he gradually falls into a drowsy sleep. The scene that follows is quite terrifying. Let's read a passage. Before long, the howling wind rattled the branches of the fir trees, tapping at Lockwood's window. Lockwood, intending to roll over and go back to sleep, found the branches too bothersome. He got out of bed and punched through the glass with his fist, reaching out to grab the tangled branch. But instead of grabbing the branch, he caught hold of a cold, small hand. A melancholic voice sobbed, "Let me in, let me in." "Who are you?" I asked, struggling, meanwhile, to disengage myself. "Catherine Linton," it replied, shiveringly. "I'm come home. I'd lost my way on the moor." As it spoke, I discerned, obscurely, a child's face looking through the window. Terror made me cruel, and, finding it useless to attempt shaking the creature off, I pulled its wrist onto the broken pane and rubbed it to and fro till the blood ran down and soaked the bedclothes. Still it wailed, "Let me in," and maintained its tenacious gripe, almost maddening me with fear. I seemed to keep them closed above a quarter of an hour, yet, the instant I listened again, there was the doleful cry moaning on. "It is 20 years," mourned the voice. 20 years. I've been away for 20 years. Just when Lockwood was about to collapse, Mr. Heathcliff appeared at the door of the room. Although he was very angry that Lockwood had slept in this room, when he heard Catherine's name, his emotions were evidently stirred. Heathcliff asked Mr. Lockwood to leave the room, and when he went in, he opened the window and sobbed bitterly. Come in, Cathy, do come." "Oh, my heart's darling." This scene was completely different from Heathcliff's usual demeanor, and his mournful appearance evoked pity in Lockwood. But after leaving the room, Heathcliff immediately reverted to his bad temper, scolding Zillah and his daughter-in-law who was reading. So, Wuthering Heights exudes a strangeness everywhere. Tangled in nightmares all night long, at this moment, Lockwood had no mood, No energy to explore what had happened at the manor. He just wanted to go back to Thrushcross Grange. When the housekeeper Mrs. Dean came to deliver dinner, Lockwood couldn't help asking her about the situation of Heathcliff's family. So, the secret about 2 families and 3 generations slowly unfolded in Mrs. Dean's narration. The story goes like this. At that time, the master of Wuthering Heights was still Mr. Earnshaw, who had a son named Hindley and a daughter named Catherine. Once, Mr. Earnshaw went to Liverpool on business, and a few days later, he returned with a dirty child. This child was found by Mr. Earnshaw on the streets of Liverpool. After inquiring for a long time and not finding the child's relatives, he brought the orphan back and named him Heathcliff. This was originally the name of Mr. Earnshaw's other son, but sadly, that little boy died young. Out of a strange, inexplicable affection, Mr. Earnshaw treated this boy named Heathcliff with special fondness. This stirred resentment in his own son Hindley, who often clashed physically with Heathcliff. Unlike Hindley, his daughter Catherine was close in age to Heathcliff, and the two gradually became good playmates, their relationship growing stronger. Except for old Mr. Earnshaw and Catherine, nobody in the household liked Heathcliff. Living in this abnormal state, Heathcliff suppressed both pride and inferiority in his heart. In fact, he didn't feel warmth, which made his character volatile and eccentric. When old Mr. Earnshaw noticed Hindley bullying Heathcliff often, he intervened and sent his own son Hindley away to study elsewhere, getting him out of the house. With Hindley's mischief gone, Catherine and Heathcliff's affection deepened over time. Unfortunately, this blissful time only lasted for 3 years, until Mr. Earnshaw passed away. Next, Hindley returned to Wuthering Heights with his new wife, becoming the master of the estate. Years of accumulated resentment finally erupted, and as soon as Hindley returned, he degraded Heathcliff to a servant, assigning him the dirtiest and most tiring tasks, making him eat and live with the servants, denying him education, and forbidding him from seeing Catherine. Faced with Hindley's actions, Heathcliff silently endured, burying the seeds of hatred in his heart. Love can save, but hatred not only destroys others, but also oneself. Once planted, the seeds of this hatred would grow into a terrible force. Fortunately, there was Catherine. She had grown into a beautiful and lively young lady who would teach Heathcliff everything she learned and accompany him in work and play. They didn't care about punishment, whether it was reciting the Bible or being whipped. As long as they were together, they disregarded those penalties. Catherine's love could be said to be the only sunshine illuminating Heathcliff's dark life. However, one time while out, Catherine unexpectedly fell ill. During her recovery, she met Edgar, the young master of Thrushcross Grange. Edgar was refined and had excellent manners. For Catherine, who grew up in the seclusion of Wuthering Heights, he presented a fatal temptation. She had never seen such a gentleman. She stayed at Thrushcross Grange for 5 weeks, experiencing luxurious parties and beautiful dresses. All this beauty awakened Catherine's vanity. When she returned to Wuthering Heights, Catherine was no longer the untamed wild child she used to be. She changed into a shiny, elegant young lady. The contrast between the two was so stark that when Heathcliff saw his own grimy face and hands, and the clothes he hadn't changed in 3 months, he felt inferior. He hid behind a chair, and Catherine noticed him hiding there. But the joy of their reunion overwhelmed her. She paid no attention to those details, rushed over, kissed Heathcliff's face, and earnestly suggested, "You should wash your face and comb your hair. You'll look more decent." However, Heathcliff felt mocked and abruptly withdrew his hand, shouting, "I like to be dirty." Then he angrily stormed out. Later on, Catherine and Heathcliff made up, but their relationship changed. That was because Catherine had something else in her heart. She was filled with longing for high society life. Since returning from Thrushcross Grange, Catherine had been in frequent contact with the Lintons. Whenever she was with them, Catherine never showed rudeness. She wanted to get along well with the Lintons, to be as gentle and graceful as Edgar's sister, and to demonstrate her ladylike manners in front of them. However, when the Lintons expressed disgust towards Heathcliff, Catherine never defended her companion. She pretended to be indifferent. But when she was alone at home, she discarded that facade and turned into a carefree little madcap, playing with Heathcliff. Heathcliff also expressed his disdain for the Lintons. They were different kinds of people. At this point, Catherine wouldn't agree with him either. She found herself caught between the Lintons and Heathcliff, feeling truly torn and experiencing a fractured life. One day, Hindley was out and Heathcliff wanted to spend time with Catherine. However, Catherine invited Edgar Linton and his sister Isabella over. Heathcliff complained, "Cathy, you spend more time with the Lintons than with me." Facing this reproach, Catherine suddenly erupted, "What do you talk about? You might be dumb or a baby for anything you say to amuse me, or for anything you do, either. It's no company at all when people know nothing and say nothing," she muttered. At that moment, Edgar Linton arrived. He was entering as Heathcliff was exiting. In that instant, Catherine clearly noticed the difference between the two. It was so obvious. The contrast was like switching from a desolate, coal mining area to a beautiful, fertile valley. Indeed, they were people from different classes. Through years of hard labor, Heathcliff's early education had vanished. Now he had become sluggish, coarse in appearance, and his childhood experiences had made him very solitary, which later evolved into near brutal insensitivity. For a few acquaintances around him, Heathcliff deliberately aroused their disgust instead of respect, deriving a sick pleasure from it, as if seeking revenge. So, he was vastly different from Edgar Linton. Catherine welcomed Edgar's arrival, wanting to send Mrs. Dean away. But Mrs. Dean refused, so Catherine, as usual, ruthlessly pinched Mrs. Dean's arm. This caused Mrs. Dean extreme pain, and she cried out, "Miss, you have no right to pinch me." Seeing Catherine treat those around her so brutally in front of the Lintons made her feel ashamed and embarrassed. Hastily denying it, she said, "I didn't do that." Mrs. Dean pointed to the bruise on her arm, exposing her lie, which ignited Catherine's inner wildness. Feeling humiliated, she slapped Mrs. Dean hard, leaving Edgar astonished. Seeing his beloved girl's tantrum and hypocrisy, he was very surprised. He stepped in to intervene, but Catherine instinctively slapped him too. Edgar was shocked. No one had ever treated him like this before. He stood there for a moment, then walked out pale-faced. Finally realizing the severity of the situation, Catherine didn't want Edgar to leave. But Edgar said that Catherine frightened him, and he would never come back again. Catherine burst into tears, saying, "I'll be miserable all night if you go like this." Out of politeness, kindness, and sympathy, Edgar hesitated when he reached the yard, then turned back and went back into the house. After this incident, Edgar decided to propose to Catherine, and she agreed. But Catherine had a secret. She didn't love Linton, she loved Heathcliff. "If Hindley had not brought Heathcliff so low, I shouldn't have thought of marrying anyone else. It would degrade me to marry Heathcliff now, so he shall never know how I love him, and that, not because he's handsome, Nellie, but because he's more myself than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same, and Linton's is as different as a moonbeam from lightning or frost from fire." As Catherine spoke these words, Heathcliff was nearby. When he heard Catherine say that marrying him would degrade herself, he felt deeply humiliated and quietly walked away. While Catherine proclaimed, "Who is to separate us, pray? They'll meet the fate of Milo." "Not as long as I live, Ellen," for no mortal creature. Every Linton on the face of the earth might melt into nothing before I could consent to forsake Heathcliff. Oh, that's not what I intend, that's not what I mean. I shouldn't be Mrs. Linton were such a price demanded. He'll be as much to me as he has been all his lifetime. Edgar must shake off his antipathy and tolerate him, at least. You see, Catherine was so contradictory. Although she understood how important Heathcliff was to her, she knew her feelings for him, yet she still accepted Edgar's proposal. Heathcliff never imagined that amidst status and power, his relationship with Catherine could be so easily discarded. So, on a stormy night, Heathcliff left in anger, leaving Wuthering Heights behind. The deeper the love, the more painful the hurt. When one considers their love to be their entire life, losing them means the end of life itself. For Heathcliff, Catherine was everything. So when he thought that Catherine abandoned him, the world turned dark, and he felt like a monster abandoned in the moor. It was at this moment that the gears of fate began to turn. After Heathcliff's abrupt departure, Catherine couldn't bear it. She fell seriously ill, becoming more capricious, irritable, and arrogant than ever before. Gradually, time changes many things. 3 years later, Catherine married Edgar. Initially, their marriage seemed harmonious, but this calm was short-lived. One September evening, their lives were shattered. Because Heathcliff returned, after so long, no one knew what he had been through. But now he returned in splendor. Heathcliff didn't receive enough love, so the hatred in his heart hadn't dissipated. After returning, he had completely changed, becoming someone else entirely. He had grown into a tall, robust, well-built, handsome man. His straight stature suggested military service, and his facial expressions and demeanor appeared much more mature than Edgar's, displaying a wise countenance that erased all traces of his past destitution and lowliness. His eyebrows were low, his eyes filled with black flames, hiding a wildness within. Though he seemed overly serious, he also had an elegance, bearing an imposing demeanor and refined temperament. Catherine kept her eyes on Heathcliff, afraid that he would disappear again in a blink of an eye. She was overjoyed, but Heathcliff didn't look at her much. Though occasionally he would glance swiftly in her direction. But each time he withdrew his gaze, he appeared more confident than before. Because from the other's eyes, he felt unreserved joy. Both were immersed in the joy of reunion, feeling no embarrassment. With Heathcliff's return, there began a more frequent exchange between Thrushcross Grange and Wuthering Heights. Just when everything seemed prosperous, Isabella, Linton's sister, confessed to everyone that she had fallen in love with Heathcliff. Although Catherine opposed it, describing Heathcliff as brutal and greedy, hoping Isabella would give up her unrealistic fantasies about him. But Isabella didn't believe her sister-in-law. During an argument with Catherine, Heathcliff declared that he had returned for revenge. He wouldn't give up his hatred for Catherine's sweet words. Instead, if Isabella loved him, that was even better. Because this girl could become his best tool for revenge, how cruel these words were. Before long, Heathcliff proved his words with actions. He eloped with Isabella. Meanwhile, Catherine fell ill again, her mind became confused, and she developed meningitis, all while being pregnant. Edgar Linton had no choice but to neglect his sister, devoting himself to caring for his wife, Catherine. Slowly, Catherine's health improved. Although still somewhat confused and sometimes not recognizing people, she was obviously much better than before. 6 weeks later, Isabella sent a letter announcing that she had married Heathcliff, hoping her brother could forgive her. However, Edgar Linton did not reply to her. 2 weeks later, Isabella sent another long letter, this time addressed to Mrs. Dean. In the letter, Isabella said, Even if it were a tiger or a snake, it wouldn't frighten me like this. I hate Heathcliff to the bone, and my suffering is beyond words. I was so foolish. After reading Isabella's letter, Mrs. Dean was extremely worried. It was clearly a cry for help. This little girl was in dire straits, and she had to go to Wuthering Heights to see her. When Mrs. Dean arrived at Wuthering Heights, she found that the once lively and bright yard now appeared gloomy and desolate, with stains and dust everywhere on the cupboards and tables. What's worse, Isabella seemed to have been infected by the indifferent atmosphere around her. Her beautiful face became pale and haggard. One's well-being or misery shows on their face, and Isabella was clearly unhappy. Heathcliff then asked Mrs. Dean about Catherine's condition and demanded that Mrs. Dean find a way for him to meet with Catherine. Otherwise, I won't let you leave Wuthering Heights. Look at this man, still ruthless as ever. Mrs. Dean refused his request. But Heathcliff persisted, saying, "Do you think she's about to forget me? You know she won't. You and I both know that every time she thinks of Linton, she thinks of me 1,000 times. There are 2 words that summarize my future: death and hell. Living after losing Catherine is hell." He didn't care about Isabella's feelings as he spoke these words. He then said, "But I was confused for a moment, thinking Catherine valued Edgar Linton's love more than mine." Bah! Linton is nothing compared to her dogs and horses in Catherine's eyes. He's not worth loving, unlike me. How could Catherine love something he doesn't have? In the end, Mrs. Dean was forced to agree to help Heathcliff deliver a letter to Catherine, and if she agreed, find a chance for them to meet. For days later, Mrs. Dean finally got an opportunity and gave the letter to Catherine. Although she didn't get any response, Heathcliff boldly barged in. Soon, he found the room where Catherine was. He rushed to her side and hugged her tightly. Heathcliff didn't speak, nor did he let go of her hands. They hugged for about 5 minutes. Catherine kissed him first, and Heathcliff was heartbroken, unable to breathe, unable to bear looking at her face. From the moment he saw Catherine, Heathcliff knew she wasn't going to get better. "Oh, Cathy! Oh, my life! How can I bear it?" was the first sentence he uttered, in a tone that did not seek to disguise his despair. "What now?" said Catherine, leaning back and returning his look with a suddenly clouded brow. Her humor was a mere vein for constantly varying caprices. "You and Edgar have broken my heart, Heathcliff, and you both come to bewail the deed to me, as if you were the people to be pitied." Heathcliff had knelt on one knee to embrace her. He attempted to rise, but she seized his hair and kept him down. "I wish I could hold you," she continued, bitterly, "till we were both dead. I shouldn't care what you suffered." "I care nothing for your sufferings. Why shouldn't you suffer? I do. Will you forget me? Will you be happy when I am in the earth? Will you say 20 years hence, that's the grave of Catherine Earnshaw? I loved her long ago, and was wretched to lose her, but it is past. I've loved many others since. My children are dearer to me than she was." You see, Catherine's emotions were extreme anger, extreme despair, and extreme heaviness. Heathcliff replied, "Don't torture me till I'm as mad as yourself. Are you possessed with the devil to talk in that manner to me when you are dying? Do you reflect that all those words will be branded in my memory and eating deeper eternally after you have left me? You know you lie to say I have killed you, and, Catherine, you know that I could as soon forget you as my existence. Is it not sufficient for your infernal selfishness that while you are at peace I shall writhe in the torments of hell?" Their feelings were so intense that even if death took them away, the flame of life burned fiercely. Catherine said, "I'm not wishing you greater torment than I have, Heathcliff. I only wish us never to be parted, And should a word of mine distress you hereafter, think I feel the same distress underground, and for my own sake, forgive me." Heathcliff replied, "You teach me now how cruel you've been, cruel and false. Why did you despise me? Why did you betray your own heart, Cathy? I have not one word of comfort. You deserve this. You have killed yourself. What right had you to leave me? What right? Answer me, for the poor fancy you felt for Linton. Because misery and degradation and death and nothing that God or Satan could inflict would have parted us, you, of your own will, did it? I have not broken your heart, you have broken it, and in breaking it you have broken mine. Let me alone, sobbed Catherine. If I've done wrong, I'm dying for it. It is enough. You left me too, but I won't upbraid you. I forgive you. Forgive me. It is hard to forgive, and to look at those eyes and feel those wasted hands, he answered. Kiss me again, and don't let me see your eyes. I forgive what you have done to me. I love my murderer, but yours. How can I? They were silent, their faces hid against each other, and washed by each other's tears. Shortly after, Edgar returned. Seeing Heathcliff, he was furious and astonished. He rushed toward Heathcliff, but Heathcliff placed the unconscious Catherine into Edgar's arms, asking him to attend to his wife first. At midnight, Catherine gave birth prematurely. Her child was born, only 7 months old. 2 hours later, Catherine passed away. Edgar wept bitterly, finally collapsing on the pillow, pale, silent, just like the Catherine lying beside him. Catherine's funeral was set for Friday. Before that, her coffin was placed in the living room, where Linton kept vigil day and night. Meanwhile, Heathcliff stayed in the garden every night without rest. Mrs. Dean was moved by his determination and decided to give him a chance to bid Catherine a final farewell. During the few hours that Linton rested, Mrs. Dean opened a window and Heathcliff cautiously entered. He opened the small golden box around Catherine's neck, containing her husband's hair. Heathcliff took out that strand of hair and replaced it with one of his own black hair. Mrs. Dean picked up the lighter hair, opened the box, twisted the 2 strands together, and placed them back inside, the 3 of them tangled together, inseparable. The day after Catherine's funeral, Isabella escaped back. She was in a sorry state, with a deep wound under one ear. The cold weather prevented excessive bleeding, but Isabella's fair face was marred with bruises. After Mrs. Dean bandaged her wound and changed her clothes, Isabella removed her ring from her ring finger and threw it into the fireplace. She cursed Heathcliff fiercely, blaming him for ruining her love and her life, wishing that devil would disappear immediately. Then Isabella told Mrs. Dean what had happened. Last night, just before midnight, Isabella deliberately provoked Heathcliff. She said, "At the Grange, everyone knows your sister would have been living now had it not been for Mr. Heathcliff. After all, it is preferable to be hated than loved by him. When I recollect how happy we were, how happy Catherine was before he came, I'm fit to curse the day." These words triggered Heathcliff's explosive anger. He grabbed a dining knife and threw it at Isabella, cutting her ear. Hindley then rushed in, and the 2 men fought. Isabella managed to escape quickly and returned to Thrushcross Grange. Isabella didn't stay long at Thrushcross Grange. She settled in the south. Several months later, she wrote a letter saying she had given birth to a son, her and Heathcliff's son, named Linton. Half a year after Catherine's death, her brother Hindley also passed away. Heathcliff became the new master of Wuthering Heights. He cruelly retaliated against Hindley's son Hareton, humiliating the boy just as Hindley had treated him years ago. Meanwhile, at Thrushcross Grange, Edgar underwent significant changes after Catherine's death. He resigned from all his duties and never ventured far from home again. The farthest he went was to Catherine's grave. He deeply missed his wife. Fortunately, Catherine left behind a daughter. This daughter soon comforted his heart. Edgar named her Catherine and called her Cathy, creating a magical connection between the little girl and her mother. Cathy was a very infectious child who brought sunshine to Thrushcross Grange. Under Edgar's protection, Cathy grew up without leaving Thrushcross Grange until she was 13. She was very curious about the outside world and wanted to go to the highest cliff to see. At the age of 13, Isabella wrote a letter saying she had been ill for 4 months, pleading for her brother's visit to bid her final farewell and to take care of young Linton, her son with Heathcliff. Upon receiving the letter, Edgar immediately set off southward. During her father's absence, Cathy sneaked out and ventured to Wuthering Heights, where she met Hareton. When Mrs. Dean found her, Cathy was leisurely chatting with Hareton. Learning that Hareton was not the master or a servant, but her cousin, Cathy burst into tears. Initially angered by Cathy's contempt, Hareton softened upon seeing her cry. Hareton, now a tall and handsome young man, dressed like a laborer on a farm. Although Heathcliff didn't physically abuse him, he made no effort to correct Hareton's bad habits, delighting in his ignorance. The more degraded Hareton became, the more satisfied Heathcliff was. 3 weeks later, Edgar returned with Isabella's son, young Linton, a pale and delicate boy sitting in the carriage. This was Isabella and Heathcliff's son, Linton. After much deliberation, Edgar decided to send Linton back to Wuthering Heights. However, Heathcliff didn't welcome Linton either. He disliked the boy and seldom spent time with him. Upon Linton's return, the housekeeper and servants at Wuthering Heights also disliked the pampered young master. Thus, they grew up apart, and before they knew it, Cathy turned 16. During one of her outings, she encountered Heathcliff and was invited to Wuthering Heights. Little did she know, Heathcliff had a sinister plan in mind, to make Cathy and Linton fall in love and marry. Thus, Cathy found herself back at Wuthering Heights and reunited with Linton. Upon returning home, Cathy immediately confessed to Edgar what had transpired at Wuthering Heights, blaming her father. "Why didn't you let me be friends with Linton?" Unable to evade, Edgar briefly explained to her Heathcliff's atrocities and how he seized Wuthering Heights. He told Cathy, if not for Heathcliff, your mother would still be alive. Cathy was stunned. She had never known such extreme wickedness. She hadn't witnessed true evil. That night, Cathy tearfully asked Mrs. Dean to write a note to Linton, explaining why they couldn't see each other or be friends anymore. She also wanted to send some books to Linton. Everyone assumed Cathy and Linton would no longer be in contact. However, Mrs. Dean discovered a cherished box belonging to Cathy containing a pile of letters exchanged between her and Linton. Initially polite, the letters gradually developed into blush-inducing love letters. Mrs. Dean was astonished and angry. She took the letters to Cathy, threatening to show them to her father. Cathy broke down, begging Mrs. Dean to burn the letters. She promised she wouldn't write to Linton again. After that, Cathy became melancholic and withdrawn. One winter day, Mrs. Dean accompanied Cathy for a stroll. Unpleasant things happened when they encountered Heathcliff. Upon meeting, Heathcliff berated Cathy, saying, "You treat love as a joke. Do you know how heartbroken Linton is for you? His health is deteriorating day by day, and he's close to death." Then, Heathcliff lowered himself, pleading with Cathy, "Please save Linton." Heathcliff was truly cunning, but Cathy believed every word he said. When Edgar learned of this, he was furious and issued a prohibition, forbidding Cathy from going to Wuthering Heights. Despite Cathy's tears and protests, it was to no avail. Thus, Cathy and Linton could only maintain their connection through letters. After half a year had passed, they finally persuaded Edgar. Edgar allowed them to meet within the Thrushcross Grange. They would meet once a week and Mrs. Dean would supervise. But during their first meeting, Linton didn't adhere to the agreement. He arranged to meet Cathy less than 500 meters away from Wuthering Heights, which was actually Heathcliff's idea. During the second meeting, the plot truly unfolded. Heathcliff suddenly appeared, forcibly dragging Linton back home. Terrified, Linton collapsed on the ground, only willing to let Cathy help him. So Heathcliff pleaded, saying, "Cathy, help Linton back to Wuthering Heights." And so, Cathy found herself back at Wuthering Heights. Initially, she remembered her father's warning and refused to enter the house. But she couldn't resist Linton's persuasion, and finally, she entered Wuthering Heights. As soon as Cathy and Mrs. Dean stepped inside, Heathcliff locked the door. Heathcliff then sternly warned them, "You better obey." He demanded that Cathy marry Linton the next day, otherwise they would face daily beatings. Faced with Heathcliff's brutality and malice, Linton sat quietly in his chair, as timid as a mouse, seemingly unaffected by it all. He was a weak person. This continued until 5 days later when Mrs. Dean was finally released. Luckily, in the dead of night, with Linton's help, Cathy managed to escape back to Thrushcross Grange. And that was Edgar's final goodbye to his daughter. That very night, Edgar passed away, thankfully with his beloved daughter by his side. Edgar's funeral was hastily arranged. On the same day as the funeral, Heathcliff personally came to take Cathy back to Wuthering Heights, and Cathy didn't resist. She said, "I will go. Linton is my only love in this world. Despite your efforts to make him hate me, to make me hate him, you cannot make us resent each other. I know he loves me, so I love him too. Mr. Heathcliff, you are unloved. When you die, no one will shed a tear for you." After returning to Wuthering Heights, Cathy found Linton's health had deteriorated significantly. She begged Heathcliff to call a doctor, but he refused. He also forbade the servants from attending to Linton. Before long, Linton passed away. A few days later, Heathcliff showed Cathy Linton's will, declaring that he had inherited all of Linton's property, leaving Cathy with nothing. Now both Wuthering Heights and Thrushcross Grange belong to Heathcliff. Mrs. Dean's story ended here. Listening to the story, Mr. Lockwood gradually recovered. He realized Heathcliff was truly as terrifying as a devil. He decided he didn't want to stay there for another 6 months. Now, the only young people left at Wuthering Heights were Cathy and Hareton, who initially didn't get along. Because of Heathcliff, Hareton had received no education and couldn't read. Catherine said, "So you've turned into a fool." Cathy scorned him and provoked him by imitating Hareton's accent while reading, which hurt his pride. Hareton, enraged, slapped Cathy and then threw the books into the fireplace. Then he stormed out. At this point, Mr. Heathcliff returned, and Mr. Lockwood informed him face-to-face that he would be leaving for London next week and wouldn't be renewing his lease after the year was up. And with that, he left Wuthering Heights. So, what happened next? Fast forward to September of that year, Mr. Lockwood was invited to a hunting ground in the north. On a whim, he suddenly felt that it was very close to Thrushcross Grange, and he wanted to go see it. After riding his horse for 3 hours, he finally arrived at Thrushcross Grange. The new housekeeper busily helped him settle into his room and informed him that Mrs. Dean no longer lived there. She had moved to Wuthering Heights. So Mr. Lockwood went to visit everyone at Wuthering Heights. The doors and windows were all open, and the air was filled with the scent of flowers. Didn't it feel like Wuthering Heights had changed? It no longer exuded the same eerie feeling. Rockwood stood at the door and heard a sweet, silver bell-like voice saying, "This is the 3rd time, you idiot. I won't tell you again. Remember it properly, or I'll pull your hair." Another voice, deep and gentle, replied, "Okay, Give me a kiss then, see how diligently I'm studying. It was Cathy teaching Heathcliff to read. When Rockwood left, these two couldn't stand each other. But now Cathy is earnestly teaching Heathcliff to read, and he obediently follows along, even asking kisses from Cathy as a reward after finishing. In conversation with Mrs. Dean, Rockwood learned that Heathcliff had died. What happened? It was less than 2 weeks after Rockwood left that Mrs. Dean was summoned to Wuthering Heights by Heathcliff. Here, she witnessed everything change, especially Cathy and Heathcliff. Initially, they ignored each other. But then Cathy changed her attitude, feeling deeply guilty for her past treatment of Heathcliff. However, Heathcliff remained stubborn, still ignoring Cathy. On sunny days, he'd go hunting. On rainy ones, he'd smoke with Joseph. Until one day, Heathcliff got injured while hunting and had to stay home. Cathy finally found the chance to speak to him, but at first, he ignored her. Cathy then grabbed Heathcliff's pipe and threw it into the fireplace. Yes, they fought again. Finally, Cathy hesitated, realizing the tension. She reached out, lightly kissed Heathcliff's cheek, then quickly sat back, pretending nothing happened. Afterward, Cathy gave Mrs. Dean a book to give to Heathcliff, saying, "If he's willing to accept, I'll come and teach him properly. If he refuses, I'll go upstairs and leave him alone." Mrs. Dean took the book to Heathcliff, who didn't throw it away. So Cathy quietly approached and sat beside him. Thus, reconciliation occurred between them. They grew closer, though Heathcliff didn't immediately become a gentleman of letters, and Cathy sometimes acted willfully. But they clearly enjoyed each other's company, learning mutual respect and deepening their love. Heathcliff soon noticed Heathcliff's care for Cathy. Then, something important happened. Once, Cathy angered Heathcliff, who grabbed her, ready to strike her. It was then that Heathcliff rushed in, begging Heathcliff to spare Cathy. Heathcliff was surprised. He had no idea these two young people had developed feelings. Then he stared at Cathy's face, unmoving. Heathcliff then covered his eyes with his hand, turned away, and said calmly, "You must remember, don't provoke me again, or I will kill you. As for Catherine Earnshaw, if I find him obeying you, I will send him elsewhere to beg for food. Your love will turn him into a vagabond, a beggar. Go! All of you, get out!" After this incident, Heathcliff solemnly told Cathy he wouldn't tolerate anyone speaking ill of Heathcliff. If Heathcliff is indeed a devil, then so be it. I will stand by his side. It was then that Cathy realized, for Heathcliff was like a father figure. From then on, Cathy never offended Heathcliff in front of Heathcliff, nor spoke ill of him again. They grew closer, one as a student, the other as a teacher, both busy and joyful. One day, Heathcliff walked in, saw the scene, and strangely didn't rage, but waved them away. Heathcliff told Mrs. Dean, "There's a strange change approaching, and I am shrouded in its shadow." Since Catherine's death, Heathcliff had lost interest in daily life, forgetting even to eat and drink. But seeing these two young people who had just left the room, he suddenly realized they were the only tangible things left. Heathcliff said to Mrs. Dean, "He bears an astonishing resemblance to Catherine. It's terrifying. Every time I see Heathcliff, I think of Catherine." You may think appearance is what troubles me the most, but it's actually the least significant, because to me, is there anything that isn't related to her? The whole world is a dreadful collection of memories, constantly reminding me that Catherine did indeed exist, but now I have lost her. Since then, Heathcliff began pacing around the house, often muttering to himself about frightening things. He started avoiding meals with others, sometimes eating only once a day. One evening, Heathcliff went for a stroll in the garden. He returned from outside in the early morning, trembling all over but with a joyful expression on his face. He said, he stood on the edge of hell, and today he saw heaven. After that, Heathcliff stopped eating and drinking, and he didn't sleep at night anymore. He continued murmuring, his tone low and sincere, though nobody knew what he was saying except for Catherine's name. The next morning, Mrs. Dean pushed open the door and found Heathcliff dead. Everyone was indifferent to Heathcliff's death except poor Hareton, who had suffered the most from him and was the only one truly grieving. He sat beside the body, weeping bitterly, holding Heathcliff's hand and kissing that cruel and mocking face. He mourned deeply for the deceased, with genuine sorrow emanating from a kind heart. Mrs. Dean recounted everything that had happened during that time. She told Rookwood that Cathy and Hareton had decided to marry and would move to Thrushcross Grange on New Year's Day. Rookwood bid farewell to Mrs. Dean and detoured to the church to find those 3 gravestones. Catherine's grave was partly obscured by the shrubbery. Edgar Linton's grave was well tended, surrounded by green grass and moss-covered. Heathcliff's grave was also there, still bare. It was uplifting news to hear. Amidst the vast sky, Rookwood wandered around the 3 graves, feeling deeply moved. Who would have thought that those sleeping in such peaceful land couldn't find rest? This is the story of Wuthering Heights. Scholar Janeway said, "This novel is like a sharp sword, piercing directly into the essence of human nature. Ultimately, it reveals to us, love is more powerful than hate. Hate only leads to destruction and despair, losing reason and judgment, immersed in hatred, destined never to find true liberation." What kind of person was Heathcliff? He was like a soul of unknown origin who, by chance, entered Wuthering Heights, where he wasn't a servant or a master, lacking a defined identity. He was extremely lonely, with only one friend and one love, Catherine. And Catherine possessed an innate fierceness and passionate pursuit of freedom. But at the time, she was just a young girl who didn't understand her own feelings and marriage. She loved Heathcliff, yet chose Edgar Linton for practical marriage. After Heathcliff lost Catherine, he embarked on a series of insane acts of revenge, feeling betrayed by the whole world. And when Catherine died, he began to hate the world, using hate to prolong his longing for her. 30 years passed, and he went from a handsome youth to an aging man, but the hate never ceased. His heart was never at peace, always filled with immense pain in his unattainable and unfulfilled desires. Rather than Catherine tormenting him, it was himself unwilling to let go, imprisoning himself with hate. When Heathcliff discovered the love between Cathy and Hareton, whom he had imprisoned and tormented, he seemed to see shadows of his younger self and Catherine. It was at this moment that Heathcliff finally found peace. Steadfast hearts will love each other no matter the circumstances. Emotions are resurrected like this. Love finally extinguishes hate. On a stormy night, Heathcliff sat in the little cottage where he used to play with Catherine, smiling as he ended his life. His only wish was to be buried beside Catherine after death. Heathcliff's life was consumed by revenge. He ruined many lives. But in the end, what truly brought him peace wasn't the satisfaction of revenge, but love. That's the most important thing in life. The more love, the better life becomes. And here, I hope you can understand Wuthering Heights through this journey.